Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu wa sallam wa baraka nabina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And good evening and welcome, brothers and sisters, to another installment of the Reverts Roundtable. And customarily what we do on the roundtable is we pick a topic that we think is pertinent to our community, the community of people who have converted to Islam. They were not born as Muslims. And we kind of, talk about it. And then after that, we open the opportunity for discussion and for sharing and for peer-to-peer support surrounding the topic or other topics which we want to discuss. And tonight, we will be looking at a topic which I think is very significant and something which is definitely near and dear to my heart. And we have entitled it, Reaching in Between the Bars, the Role of the Free in the Lives of the Incarcerated. And so we're going to be talking about the role that we should play as revert/convert Muslims in the lives of, as free revert/convert Muslims in the lives of Muslims who are incarcerated. So let's begin first and foremost with the why. Why this topic? So brothers and sisters, as reverts/converts in the U.S., where more people are incarcerated than anywhere else in the world, and the fastest growing religion in America's prisons is Islam. And therefore, it is not uncommon for some of us, some of the people who are listening to my voice right now, some of us to have done time, or to be related to someone who has done time, or know someone who has been locked up. Most of us have some type of connection with somebody in prison just by virtue of living in a country where more people are incarcerated than anybody else, anywhere else in the world. So we should understand better than most the crucial need for Muslims on the outside to reach in to prisons and try to reach their incarcerated brothers and sisters. So why should we reach in? Why should we make any effort to reach into prisons and reach the people who are incarcerated from our brothers and sisters, fellow Muslims in prison? Well, there are a few reasons, and I'd like to share some of them. So one, we should do this because we should be better able to empathize, either because, as we said, some of us have been incarcerated, or we are related to someone who's incarcerated, or we know someone who's been incarcerated, etc. Another reason is because as reverts or converts, native-born American citizens, a lot of us Afro and Latino Americans, we are familiar with the systemic societal challenges of the black and brown people who make up the majority of Muslim communities in prison. We are more able to relate, to connect, and to reach incarcerated Muslims. Why? Because in many cases, their struggles are our struggles. Their experience is our experience. We can relate to what they're going through. And so that makes us better able to practice empathy when it comes to the incarcerated. Number three, we should do this because if we don't, in many cases, no one else will. There are many communities, and I don't want to, I want to make sure that I'm fair. There are many communities where they have dedicated resources to prison ministry. They either just have financial resources they dedicate, and they use those resources to provide food for their ayad, for their religious holidays and feasts. They'll supply them with religious materials. They'll do what they can with money. And there are also communities where they also have dedicated human resources. People who actually will go in physically. So just to be fair, that does exist, and it's not uncommon. But it's also quite common for communities to have no dedicated resources to prison ministry. Nothing. They do absolutely nothing at all. It's not even on their radar. Another reason why we should do this is because in many cases, the religious needs of our brothers and sisters in prison and their overall condition in prison is horrible. And consequently, our support is desperately needed. So for example, One of the problems that Muslims in prison face across the country is staff ignorance. Staff ignorance, the ignorance of the people who are running the prison in general, and particularly the chaplains or the clergy who are responsible primarily for providing for their religious needs. In many cases, Muslims in prison are the victims of suspicion. Basically, they are considered an STG, a security threat group, a gang that is masquerading as a faith group. And so as a consequence, they are victims of suspicion, objects of suspicion. When they pray and they congregate for prayer, they think they're up to something. And so in many cases, they're denied congregational prayer. When they're praying, in many cases, even if they're praying individually, they're suspected and sometimes prevented from offering prayer. And so that ignorance of staff, as you can see, can lead to suppression of their basic constitutionally provided right to practice their religion. Another layer of that is their own ignorance. Our brothers and sisters who are incarcerated, their own ignorance, which leads to what? To error. Leads them to make very erroneous assumptions about Islam, about what they're supposed to believe and how they're supposed to behave. And that enables some of that suppression. So basically, because they have a wrong understanding of what their beliefs are, what their practices are, that kind of enables that view or that perspective or that perception of them as a security threat group, a gang. And it also, therefore, enables some of the suppression of their religious rights. And it also enables that suppression because if they're ignorant of what those rights are, because they're ignorant of their faith, they can't advocate for those rights. You can't advocate for rights you're unaware of. You don't even know you have the right to, congregate for prayer, to offer the Friday prayer, the right to have certain religious materials, etc. And also another layer of that pitiful condition they're suffering from, which is a reason why we should reach in, is because in many cases they're denied the basic needs. The basic needs, basic human needs like hygiene is something which many of them are denied and deprived of, etc. So another reason why we should do this is because the support that they require is in most cases support that many of us can easily provide. So we mentioned, for example, religious materials, hygiene, toothpaste, toothbrushes, soap, deodorant. These are things in many cases we can easily provide as individuals and as communities. So why wouldn't we do it? We should also do this because they are confined and we are free. They can't reach out to us, so we have to reach in to them. And last but not least, certainly not least, another reason why we should do this is because our religion tells us to. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran, in Surah Al-Insan, which is the 76th chapter of the Quran, verses 8 through 11, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He describes al-abrar, the exceptionally righteous people. And in part of that, in that passage where He's providing the description of the righteous people, He describes them thusly. وَيُطْعِمُونَ الطَّعَامَ عَلَى حُبِّهِ مِسْكِينًا وَيَتِيمًا وَأَسِيرًا إِنَّمَا نُطْعِمُكُمْ لِوَجْهِ اللَّهِ لا نريد منكم جزاء ولا شكورا إنا نخاف من ربنا يوما عبوسا قمطريرا فوقاهم الله شر ذلك اليوم ولقاهم نظرة وسرورا. So in this passage, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, describing the exceptionally righteous people, providing their description, He says, they feed, despite their love for their own sustenance, they feed the destitute, the orphan, and the prisoner. Underscore the word prisoner, saying, we feed you for no other reason than the pleasure of Allah. We desire no compensation from you nor gratitude. We simply fear from our Lord an incredibly stressful day. So Allah will deliver them from the horror of that day and grant them radiance and eternal joy. So you notice in this ayah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions that one of the qualities of the exceptionally righteous is that they feed, they take care of the needs, they provide for the needs of prisoners. And he mentioned that the reward that they will receive for doing that for his sake is he will deliver them from the horror of the day of judgment and grant them radiance, light in their faces, and eternal joy and bliss and pleasure in paradise. So Mujahid, I'm going to mention some of the commentaries of the commentators on this verse and what is intended by the word prisoner in the verse. So Mujahid, rahimahullah ta'ala, the student of Ibn Abbas, he said, Huwa al-mahbus. The prisoner encompasses anyone detained. Ata, he said, Huwa al-Muslim yuhbasu bihaq. It refers to a Muslim who is rightfully detained. So how much more in the case of the wrongfully detained? What about the people who are in jail or in prison and they are not guilty of anything or not guilty of the crime for which they have been incarcerated? Mujahid and Sa'id ibn Jubair, they also commented. They said, Huwa al-masjoon min ahl al-qibla. It refers to the incarcerated from those who pray facing the Kaaba in Mecca, meaning the incarcerated amongst the believers. And last but not least, Qatada, rahimahullah ta'ala, he said, Amar Allahu bil asra and yuhsan ilayhim wa inna asrahum yawma idhin li ahl al-shirk. I'm sorry. Wa inna asrahum yawma idhin li ahl al-shirk wa akhuka al-muslim ahaqqu an tut'imhu. He said, Allah commands in these verses that benevolence is shown to the incarcerated. Underscore this phrase from Qatada. He said, Allah commands in these verses that benevolence is shown to the incarcerated. Allah is commanding us to take care of them. It's part of our religion, and this is one of the major reasons, if not the most important reason, why we should do this work. Because Allah commands us to be benevolent to those who are incarcerated. They're prisoners at the time, he says. He goes on to say that when this verse was revealed, the prisoners of the believers at that time, the incarcerated amongst the believers at that time, the ones that the believers had incarcerated and they were being commanded to be kind to and compassionate towards and benevolent towards, were idolaters. They were told to be kind and benevolent toward prisoners who were idolaters. Then he goes on to say, and your fellow Muslim is more entitled to your support. If you're supposed to be benevolent to non-Muslim prisoners, how much more so should you be benevolent to Muslim prisoners? طيب. Then the question comes, well, why not? Why not? Why do people choose not to do this? If we have all of these good reasons, including a good religious reason to do it, why do people not do this work? Why do they opt out? So there are a number of factors, brothers and sisters, that contribute to and justifications that are offered for withholding support for incarcerated Muslims. So one of them is blissful ignorance. Many people, brothers and sisters, are simply unaware that there are Muslims in prison or that they need support. They think that they have everything. What? They have everything they need. They're in prison. The government supports them. They give them, 3 meals a day. They give them a place to stay. They give them, bedding. They give them personal hygiene. If they need religious materials, they provide for that. Everything they need is provided for, right? Some people don't even realize they're in there. And those who realize that think that they have everything that they need. Blissful ignorance. Type number 2, inattention. For many, it's just not on their radar. They have not given any thought to incarcerated Muslims. These people, to them, are out of sight and consequently out of mind. Number 3, you have people who say things like, they deserve it. They're in there for a reason. So I'm not going to help them. Why? Because they're criminals. They committed crimes. Why should I help them? And many people are of the mind that every single inmate, every single person in prison or in jail is guilty, is inherently evil, a lost cause, and absolutely deserves to be treated poorly, even inhumanely. Whatever they get, they deserve it, because that's why they're in there. They're in there for a reason. And so if they don't have the ability to practice their religion, if they're denied religious materials, if they don't have the basic hygiene, soap, to wash and cleanse themselves, that's their problem. Why they commit the crimes they commit in the first place. Some people, the reason why they withhold their support is because they're just simply what? Selfish and self-absorbed. they're unable to think or care about the plight of others. It's all about me. Or some people are just what? They're so busy with what they have going on that they're unable to what? To carve out time for what? For helping others in general and helping the incarcerated in specific. And last but not least, in some cases, people are related to people in prison and they withhold their support. They're prevented by grudges or embarrassment from offering the much needed support that these incarcerated Muslims require. So because of some falling out between that incarcerated Muslim, or because of the embarrassment and the stigma associated with incarceration, they withhold their support. So what I wanted to do really quickly is respond to one of these, actually two of them. And the first one I wanted to respond to, the reasons or justifications people give not to support, is they deserve it. They're there for a reason. They're there for a reason. They're criminals, and therefore what? They deserve whatever they get. So I wanted to respond to that one in particular, because this one is particularly to me unnerving. It's one that I don't think is appropriate for Muslims to say. I think Muslims should know better than to say that. So the first thing I want to say in response to that is not everyone in prison, or not everyone is in prison for a crime they actually committed. Not everyone is those who did do whatever they did to get into prison, not every one of them is appropriately sentenced. Not appropriately sentenced. Often the punishment is excessive and does not fit the crime. And many people who are incarcerated are victims of circumstance who, if they knew better, would do better. If the opportunities were there for them, they wouldn't have chosen the path that they chose. If they were given a choice, some of them were so desperate, they felt that they weren't given an option. And just to circle back to the first one, not everyone is in prison for a crime they committed. Two examples jump out to me, and there are many we could give, but two famous examples jump out to me. One is Khalif Browder. If you guys have ever heard of him, and if you haven't, Google him. Khalif Browder is a very good example. And the Central Park Five is another very good example of people who were incarcerated for years. And it turned out that they were completely innocent of the crimes that they committed. And so it's not appropriate to say that because somebody is incarcerated, that they're automatically guilty, they're a criminal, they're a bad person, they're inherently evil, and they're there for a reason, they shouldn't be helped. It's not even appropriate to say that. Why? Because many people in this country are incarcerated and they have not committed the crime that they're in jail for or in prison for. Another response is that in reality, brothers and sisters, we're all criminals. Each and every one of us is a criminal. Each and every one of us is a wrongdoer. Each and every one of us is guilty of sin. Let the person who is free of sin cast the first stone. The Prophet said in the hadith, Kul ibn Adam khata. All the sons of Adam are sinners. Each and every one of them is a criminal. All of us are sinners to a greater or lesser degree or lesser extent. Another response is that, brothers and sisters, salvation isn't ours to give to whomever we deem worthy and withhold from whoever we deem unworthy. It's not our place to say this person deserves it, this person doesn't deserve it, this person's incarcerated, and so therefore they don't deserve for us to reach in between those bars and try to help them because they did bad things. They're not worth saving. They're not worthy of salvation. And there's a famous hadith collected by Abu Dawood and some of the other collectors of hadith. And that hadith, the Prophet ﷺ talks about two relatives from the children of Israel. And one of them was very pious. He was very committed. He was a very religiously committed person. And the other was far from that. He was impious and he did some impious things. And he was a habitual sinner. Al-Muhim, the religious one would frequently visit the irreligious one and give him advice and encourage him to leave his ways and return to the path of righteousness. And the irreligious one would ignore those advices and would continue on the path of wickedness and iniquity. So ultimately, the religious one, he got frustrated with the failure of his relative to accept his advice. And so he ultimately said, Wallahi, la yaghfirullahu li fulan, or la yaghfirullahu lak. He said, I swear by Allah, Allah is not going to forgive you. I swear by Allah, you're too wicked. You've had multiple chances to change your ways. There's no possible way you can be forgiven. I swear by Allah, you're not going to be forgiven. Why? Because you've been given all these chances and you haven't mended your ways. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the hadith, he caused those two men to die. He resurrected both of them. And he said, Man dha alladhi yata'alla alayya an la aghfir li fulan. He said, who is the one who considers himself and to have the right to speak on my behalf and say who I am going to forgive and who I'm not going to forgive? Who is the one who considers himself in a position to say that he can say who's worthy of salvation and not worthy, who's going to be forgiven, who's not going to be forgiven? He said, فَإِنِّي قَدْ غَفَرْتُ لِفُلَانٍ. He said, indeed I have forgiven so and so. The one you said I'm not going to forgive, I've forgiven him. وَأَحْبَطْتُ عَمَلَكَ. And I have nullified your deeds. I have nullified your good deeds. So now look at this hadith, brothers and sisters. Here's a person who is extremely religious, extremely committed. And he's trying to encourage a person who's not religious to be religious. And he makes this statement where he's basically saying that this person isn't worthy of salvation. And the result was that the one who he considered unworthy was forgiven. And he himself was denied forgiveness. Brothers and sisters, this teaches us that what? It's not our place to say who deserves and who doesn't deserve, who's worthy, who's not worthy. It's our job to do what? To the best of our ability to try to help whoever we can and leave it up to them what they're going to do with Allah's hidayah. طيب, another reason why this statement is inappropriate, or this stance or posture is inappropriate, is that many of those who converted to Islam, many of those who were incarcerated, converted to Islam after committing their crime and their subsequent incarceration. Many of them converted to Islam after being incarcerated. They were exposed to Islam and became Muslims after doing whatever crimes they committed to get themselves in prison. And when you accept Islam, what happens, brothers and sisters? We should all know this. We're converts, we're reverts who have done some things before we became Muslim. Some things that are unspeakable, some things that we're ashamed of. We know that when you become Muslim, your slate gets wiped clean, irrespective of what's on that slate. In the famous hadith of Amr ibn al-As collected by Muslim, he mentioned that Allah, after being an enemy of Islam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala planted in his heart the desire to be Muslim. So he went to the Prophet ﷺ and he said, "O Messenger of Allah, extend your hand li'uba'iyak, so that I can give you the pledge of allegiance, so that I can become a Muslim." So the Prophet ﷺ extended his hand, and then Amr, he said, "I withdrew my hand." And the Prophet said, "Ya Amr, malak." He said, "Amr, what's wrong with you? Don't you want to be Muslim? You said you wanted to be Muslim." So then Amr, he said, "Ya Rasulullah, uridu an ashtarit." He said, "O Messenger of Allah, I want to be Muslim, but I want to make a condition first. I want to be Muslim, but I want to set a condition." So the Prophet said, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said, "Ya Amr, mada tashtarit?" He said, "O Messenger of Allah," he said, "O Amr, what shart, what condition, what prerequisite do you want to make?" So Amr, he said, "An yughfar li." He said, "I want to accept Islam, but on the condition that my previous sins will be forgiven." He said, "I want my previous sins, I want to guarantee that my previous sins will be forgiven." Why, Messenger of Allah? Because I've done some things. I've done some unspeakable things. And I'm afraid to meet Allah with those things on my record. And the Prophet said, he responded, he said, "Ya Amr, ama alimta anna al-Islam yahdimu ma kana qablahu." He said, "Oh Amr, don't you know that Islam, it wipes away, it totally expiates, it totally obliterates whatever came before it. Oh, Amr, your slate is going to be wiped clean. All you need to do is accept this faith, accept Islam, and your slate will be wiped clean, whatever you did. Another reason why this is a wrong thing to say, they deserve it, they're criminals, they deserve what they get, is that, brothers and sisters, we believe in our religion that everyone, and I mean everyone in all caps, deserves a second chance. Even those who have committed the most heinous crimes. Most of us are aware of the hadith of the man who killed 99 people and ultimately killed 100. He ultimately killed 100 people. And after killing the 100th person, he went to an alim, he went to a scholar, and he said, Inna rajulan qatala miyata nafsin fahal lahu min tawbah, qala na'am, wa ma yahulu baynaka wa bayna at-tawbah. That the man who killed 100 people in the end went to this alim and he said, a man killed. What if a man killed 100 people? Could he repent? Could he be forgiven by Allah? And the scholar said, Na'am. He said, certainly. وَمَا يَحُولُ بَيْنَكَ وَبَيْنَ التَّوْبَةِ. And what can stand between you and being forgiven and having your repentance accepted? One last thing I want to mention, or one of the justifications that we mentioned, was people being selfish. People just being so selfish and so self-absorbed. It's all about me. I don't have time to be worried about other people. I need to worry about my own self. The answer I would give to that is, what better way to do for self? What better way can you, O Muslim, do for yourself and focus on yourself and concentrate on yourself than for you to help incarcerated Muslims learn Islam and remain on the straight path? Because the Prophet said in the hadith that when we give da'wah, in reality, not only are we benefiting others, we're also benefiting ourselves. So if you want to be selfish, this is the best way you can be selfish, by helping these people. Because the Prophet said, لَأَنْ يَهْدِيَ اللَّهُ بِكَ رَجُلًا وَاحِدًا خَيْرٌ لَكَ مِنْ حُمُرٍ النَّعَمِ. He said, if Allah were to guide one person through you, it would be better for you than the best form of worldly wealth. So think about it, brothers and sisters. This could be the deed. This could be the one thing that you and I do that earns us paradise. Just think about that. If we really care about ourselves, if we really want to be selfish, let's do ourselves a favor, do good to our own selves by helping what? By helping these incarcerated Muslims. We'll be helping ourselves, because that might be the one deed that gets us into paradise, as the Prophet ﷺ is indicating or alluding to in this hadith. Now the question comes, brothers and sisters, what kinds of support do our incarcerated brothers and sisters need? So there's a number of ways that we can support them. I'll mention a few of them ala ujala. So one form of support that they need, maybe perhaps the most important form of support, is knowledge of their religion. They need to learn. And it's not easy for them to learn, especially depending on where they're incarcerated and what the circumstances of their incarceration are. It's difficult for them to learn their religion correctly. They might be able to get certain materials, but their ability to understand those materials and interpret them correctly are limited. Or even worse, they may get materials which are misleading, misguiding. They're misinforming them, ill-informing them, right? Giving them disinformation. So one of the best ways we can support them is by helping them to learn their religion, learn their belief system. What are they supposed to believe? The ritual worship, how do they worship? How do they clean themselves when they go to the bathroom? And morals and manners, how to conduct themselves as Muslims. Help them to refine their character. Another form of support is knowledge of their religious rights and how to self-advocate for those rights. We need to help these Muslim inmates, many of whom do not know their rights. Help them learn their rights so they can self-advocate for those rights. For example, like the right to a dedicated chaplain. Depending on the number of inmates at any given prison or in any given prison system, federal law mandates that if that number reaches a certain amount, a certain percentage, then they're entitled to have a dedicated Muslim chaplain who is hired by the state, right? Or a volunteer who is contracted, who will come in and provide them with religious services. Many of them don't know that. And so many of them are denied services simply because they don't realize that they have reached the threshold where they can have a dedicated chaplain. But another right is the right to volunteer services, the right to have people who will come in from the community and on a volunteer basis and provide ritual worship, teach them classes, provide other types of programming, right? The right to established study times and organized study groups, the right to be able to gather and learn together, learn collectively, not just study individually, but to actually gather and have specific times dedicated weekly for them to gather for this purpose, and to have organized study groups. Another right, the right to dedicated time and space for daily and weekly congregational worship. The right to dedicated time and space for daily and weekly congregational worship. That they have that right to basically get together and worship their 5 daily prayers and their weekly congregational prayer. Also the right to Islamic religious materials, that includes books, DVDs, headgear like hijabs for sisters. Actually, we should say khimars, right? Khimars for sisters and kufis for brothers, prayer rugs, etc. Federal law, brothers and sisters, mandates equal access to religious materials in prisons. So the ability to have a Quran and to read the words of their Lord is a federally provided right. That there shouldn't be a thing where they make a request for a Quran and they're given a Bible and they're denied the Quran, right? They're allowed to have access. And if the prison, for whatever reason, can't provide it, then they have to seek resources from the community to have those provided, okay? Or they have to facilitate some other means for them to have what? Those religious materials. Another example is right to food that meets their religious dietary requirements. That at the very least, the food that they should be given should be something that they as Muslims, given their dietary restrictions, should be able to consume. And that can also encompass halal food. Halal food can also be considered a right, right? If they advocate, if they know that they have this right and advocate for that what? For that right. And I want to digress here quickly because I just feel like I would be remiss if I didn't mention this. I don't know if you guys have heard of a gentleman by the name of Jake Angeli. And most of you might not know him by that name. You might know him. He was one of the Capitol rioters. And he was one of the more famous ones, one of the more iconic ones, one of the ones who, when you see his face, you know exactly who I'm talking about. He is referred to or refers to himself as the Q shaman. He was the one that went with the headdress that had the horns on it, and he had his face painted red, white, and blue. That's Jake Angeli. And so those of you who know about him know where I'm going with this. So basically, while he was incarcerated for storming the Capitol and participating in an insurrection, he demanded that he be provided on the government's dime organic food, citing that it was from his religious belief that he could only consume organic food. It's his right. It's part of his religion, and the Constitution protects religious observances. They have to provide for that. They have to provide him with organic food. And if anybody knows anything about the food that's provided in prison, it's awful. It's terrible. People in prison would love to get anything wholesome, let alone organic food. Okay? This person is demanding organic food on the government's dime. Now, he provided no evidence that this organic food, the consumption of organic food, was a tenet of shamanism. But he was granted his request. While Muslim prisoners are sometimes denied food that they can just that they can just consume. They may be given a plate of pork and beans, and they can't eat that, right? Franks and beans, the franks are made of pork, they can't eat that. And it's like, this is what it is, and your options are to eat that or to not eat it. That might be the case in some prison systems, that they're not even provided food that they can even eat given their dietary restrictions, let alone halal food. Forget about that. And what many people have, what many people have asserted and opined, given this discrepancy, that this person couldn't produce any evidence that he had to eat this. Whereas Muslims can produce ample evidence that they have certain dietary restrictions, and you could even produce evidence they have to eat what? Halal food. Zabiha, as they say, right? They could produce evidence of that. Many people say that this is an example, a clear example, that white prisoners who practice white religions are immune, one, to discrimination, and they too are awarded special favors, or they enjoy white privilege. While the black and brown prisoners with their black and brown religions are repeatedly denied their rights and face a great deal of discrimination. I'm not saying this. This is what people who have looked at the disparities, they don't have a dog in the fight. They're not Muslims themselves. They've looked at the disparities and they've made these statements. And I'll give you one example that you guys can look for from the articles about this on the internet. There's an article by Vox.com, Vox.com, and the title of it is "The Many Ways Muslims in Prison Are Denied Religious Rights." And they highlight in that article at the outset the discrepancy. How he was awarded, without any proof that he was a tenet of his religion, he was awarded what? The organic food. And Muslims have been fighting just to get Qur'ans, let alone Zabiha, in prison. So I just wanted to make that little digression with respect to their right to food that meets their religious dietary requirements. Another right is the right to practice their religion generally free of discrimination, free of being viewed as an STG, a security threat group, free of having people constantly come into their rooms searching for contraband and then confiscating their religious items like prayer rugs and kufis and Qur'ans, etc. Confiscate these items and considering them gang paraphernalia when in reality they're what? They're religious items. So they should be able to practice their religion free of discrimination. They need to know that so that they can self-advocate for these rights. Another way that we can support these inmates is we can provide them with material support. Religious items. Many can't afford to purchase some of these items. How much does a Quran cost? You go and look at IslamicBookstore.com. Look at Dar es-Salaam. And look how expensive Islamic books are. Look how expensive, how commercialized, and how capitalism has even creeped into the marketing and the sale of religious items. Religious items for many people for these prisoners are out of their reach. If they don't have somebody supporting them from outside, willing to provide these things from their family members or religious organizations or individual Muslims, many of them will not have it because they don't have the money to purchase it. It's beyond their reach. And so religious items is one of those things that we can definitely help them with. Hygiene items. In many cases, if you're indigent, you are provided with a very scant monthly supply of hygiene items. And some of it just isn't suitable for use. And so a bar of soap means a lot to an inmate. A tube of toothpaste means a lot to an inmate. A toothbrush means a lot to an inmate. Another example is miscellaneous items that many of us have and take for granted, like socks, pens, envelopes, stamps, writing paper. These are things that many indigent inmates, our Muslim brothers and sisters, don't have in prison. And so they just want to write a letter to a relative, and they don't have a pen to write with, they don't have paper to write with, they don't have, because all those things you have to purchase in prison. And so if you don't have money, and you don't have a job in prison that allows you to earn money, no matter how insignificant the amount of money you can earn is, if you don't have that, then you can't buy these items, and so you're just kind of like out of luck. And so these are things that we can support, or material support that we can provide. Another form of support is moral and emotional support. So that includes what? Visits. Volunteering to go into a prison to meet with brothers and sisters who are incarcerated and to just sit and give a class. Sit and teach them something. Sit and talk to them about their situations, etc. Be a listening ear. Be a person who your physical presence shows that you care. Written correspondence, writing to them and responding to their correspondences, etc. Another form of support is giving them help in overcoming obstacles to successful life after prison. That includes, for example, physical and behavioral addictions. So, for example, another thing that we can help Muslims who are incarcerated with is helping them overcome physical and behavioral addictions that are going to be stumbling blocks for them to return to society and become productive members of society. And last but not least, from the forms of support that we can provide is advocacy, to advocate for them. When people from outside call into a prison, speak to the institutional chaplain and tell him, hey, a lot of the guys, they don't have Qur'ans. And it's federally mandated that their religious materials are provided for them, that they have equal access to religious materials. We're willing to provide them. What is the issue? What is the stumbling block? It carries weight. It carries much more weight than if an inmate comes and says that to that same chaplain. And so we can advocate for them. We can also advocate in other ways. Some of them are over-sentenced. Some of them are wrongfully incarcerated. We can advocate for their release in whatever ways that we can and our situations and circumstances allow. So last but not least, brothers and sisters, before we open the floor for your comments, or actually two more points I wanted to make. But one of them is what are some of the things that we should do, that we can and should do in a practical sense? Let's get to the practical level. One is, as we said, visit. We can call, we can write to, and provide financial and moral support to our incarcerated relatives. We can, if we're related to them, related to people who are in prison, we can actually be on their visitation list and go and visit them. A visit means everything to the inmates. Another one is we can call them on a regular basis. If we can't get inside for whatever reason, we call. We stay in touch. I spoke with a sister, female incarcerated Muslim, about a month or so ago. And she was informing me that her father had passed away. And he had passed away some months ago. And she found out through a friend. And her family didn't tell her because I don't know if they were trying to protect her or, but she just said they don't regularly connect with me. And they didn't make the point to connect with me when my father passed away. And I had to hear from a friend that my father had passed away. And she was broken by that. She was heartbroken by that, devastated by that. And she just, I'm in here, I feel disconnected from my family, and it would just mean so much to me if they would just call me for 5 minutes once a month. If they would send me a letter, if they would send me pictures so I could see my nieces and nephews and et cetera and so on. And just heartbroken by the fact that just something as simple as a call or a letter she wasn't getting from her family members. These things mean a lot to to our incarcerated brothers and sisters. So if we're related to somebody, also the financial support that we can provide, because as we said, many of them are destitute, they're indigent. And without the financial support they get from relatives, many of them will struggle. They'll struggle in many ways. And they'll be exposed. That desperate feeling or desperation may encourage them to do things that will get them in even more trouble when they're in prison. Another thing that we can do is volunteer to provide religious lessons to incarcerated Muslims. Volunteer. Sign up to be a approved volunteer at a local prison, local jail. Go in, meet with the inmates, and provide services, provide religious services. Another thing is create a committee through your local masjid or with concerned brothers and sisters. So sometimes in the masjid, there's so much red tape, there's so much bureaucracy, you just can't get a committee off the ground. There's just so many roadblocks and so many obstacles and hurdles just to organize and be associated or be under the masjid's umbrella. So if that's the case, then just you and a bunch of concerned Muslim brothers and sisters outside the masjid, just organize yourselves and basically commit yourselves to raising funds, to making purchases, and to distributing approved materials to and other things to incarcerated brothers and sisters. So for example, you figure out what those needs are, those material needs are, and you organize yourselves to basically collect money, raise funds, Purchase whatever you need to purchase and then distribute those approved materials in those prisons and jails. Another one, donate to Islamic prison ministry programs. So if there are established prison ministry programs in your local masjid, for example, then donate. Give money to those programs so that they can have more resources to purchase the things that are needed needed by, I should say, the inmates. This is very, very important. We need to put our finger on the pulse of the situation of our brothers and sisters who are incarcerated. Find out what specific programs would be best to respond to the needs of the incarcerated Muslim communities you serve. So you're going to go into a particular jail or a particular prison. Find out every jail, every prison, the situation is different. Let's say, for example, you were going to go into a prison which is a pre-release center. You're talking about people with short sentences, and most of them are working jobs in the community or jobs in the facility, and ultimately they're preparing themselves to what? To go back to society. Their needs are going to be very different from the needs of prisoners in a maximum security prison where they have very long sentences and do not expect to be released for a long period of time. So each prison you're going to go to or jail you're going to go to, find out what the needs of those people in that prison are. So for example, one thing that's very commonly needed is Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous. That some of our brothers and sisters sadly have issues with addiction and substance abuse. And so what is very helpful for them is to have Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, but taught from an Islamic perspective. Another one is financial literacy. You got somebody who's going to go out into society. They have that stamp on their forehead, felon, which is going to make it very difficult for them to find working for an employer. And so it would be very helpful if they learn things like, for example, entrepreneur basics, or they learned a vocational skill, or they learned financial literacy and business management so that they can go out into the world and figure out how to earn money lawfully, licitly, right? Another one, stress management. It's going to be difficult. Stress management is useful for everybody, regardless of how long the sentence is or etc. All of them can use stress management. Why? Because prison is a very stressful place, a very stressful environment, very traumatic or trauma-inducing environment. Another one that's very, very important is parenting. Many of these inmates have children who they have not seen, have not interacted with, and don't know how to parent because their circumstances are such that they had kids, and during the formative years of those kids' lives, they were incarcerated. Many of them may have come from homes where they didn't receive the parenting and the care and the compassion. And so they haven't learned those skills from their own parents. And so parenting is critical. How do you parent behind bars? How do you do that? And when you get out, how do you parent? How do you repair your relationship with your kids after having been incarcerated and not, being in their lives, etc.? These are skills that many of our brothers and sisters in prison desperately need, and we could teach and help them develop. Another thing that we should do is work on creating transitional housing solutions. In our communities, a lot of these people, most people who get incarcerated will get out. Most of them will get out. And when they get out, one of the struggles they have is housing. Where am I going to live? Where am I going to stay? I shouldn't go back to the environment that because of me being in it, I got in trouble in the first place. I shouldn't go back to that environment. I need to go to an environment where I'll be insulated from the types of influences and the types of influencers who got me in trouble in the first place. And so one of the things that will help them is transitional housing, especially transitional housing with a Islamic bent, right? Because most of the transitional housing that's available has a Christian bent. And so they're forced to comply with these Christian values, Christian beliefs, Christian worship in order to stay in that transitional housing. And so that creates a very difficult situation and sometimes a severe test of faith for many of these inmates. And so another thing that we can do is talk about in our communities how we can create some type of transitional housing solutions for these inmates. Another one is advocacy. We talked a little bit about that. And innocence projects. We talked about that a little bit as well. There are people who are wrongfully incarcerated. There are people who are over-sentenced. How can we help them with their cases and help them get out of prison if they shouldn't be there, or get their sentence reduced if they've been over-sentenced? Last thing I want to say before closing out is that one of the things that keeps many Muslims on the sidelines, whether they are relatives or non-relatives of the incarcerated, is the stigma associated with incarceration. This stigma is largely a product of our Western environment and is fueled by political, racial, and un-Islamic interests. Now, in many cases, the reason why there's a stigma attached to being in prison or being incarcerated has more to do with the politics of the person who stigmatizes it, or the racial perspective or racist perspective of the person who stigmatized, etc., and has very little to do with what? With any genuine reason or cause to stigmatize the incarcerated. Brothers and sisters, we Muslims, rather than be influenced by this non-Muslim Western stigma, should be influenced by our Islamic tradition, which teaches us to deal with people based upon what they do now or are striving to do, rather than what they have done. Our religion is the religion of, we look at the person now, person before us. And we don't say, oh, well, this is who you were 3 years ago, and so I'm going to judge you based upon who you were 3 years ago. It's also important for us to recognize, brothers and sisters, that being in prison or having a criminal record alone is not sufficient to make a person a bad person. Many of the great heroes and champions of Islam were incarcerated at some point in their lives. Prophet Yusuf, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, was incarcerated. Imam Ahmed was incarcerated. Ibn Taymiyyah, rahimahullah ta'ala, was incarcerated. And Malcolm X, before he was Malcolm X, was a convicted felon. Also, brothers and sisters, bear in mind that we live in a country where prisons are considered a solution, a universal solution for social problems. If a child has truancy issues, they don't show up to school enough, they'll throw them in prison, throw them in juvenile. If a child gets into a fight at school, a schoolyard fight, a shouting match turns to a shoving match turns to what? Throwing of punches, they throw that child in jail, right? People with mental illness, nowadays, many of them are in prison. They're in prison, and the underlying cause of whatever they did to be in prison was mental illness. In fact, as they call the prisons, U.S. prisons, the new asylum. The new asylum, U.S. prisons. So you have these people with these social ills, many people who have addiction issues, behavioral addictions or substance addictions are what? Are in prison. That's a social problem, not really a criminal problem. Al-Muhim, there are people who have problems, social problems, who are in jail. Should they be stigmatized for that? And also, last but not least, we live in a country, think about this, we live in a country where people can peacefully protest social injustice and advocate for their civil and human rights and be jailed because of it. We've seen it, brothers and sisters, in recent history and in not so recent history, where people were just fighting so that they didn't have to have a water fountain that said colored on it, or a bathroom that said colored on it, that they could sit at a counter in a diner and have the same meal that other people from other races could have, sit in the same place that they could sit, shop in the same stores. When they went to those stores and they wanted to buy a shirt and they wanted to try it on, they could actually try it on. They wanted those rights because they felt that it was their civil and human right to be able to do those things. And simply because they advocate for those rights, they were jailed. They were jailed. This is the society we live in. There shouldn't necessarily be a one-to-one stigma. Every time a person is incarcerated or put behind bars, we just stigmatize them and we say that, you know what, it's just, I don't want to be associated with prison and people in prison. People in prison are not bad just because they're in prison. And so this stigma is not something that Muslims should put on the people who are incarcerated. And with that, brothers and sisters, I'll bring my remarks to a close and offer the opportunity for you to share, to comment, to critique, and to otherwise contribute to the discussion. هذا وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على نبينا محمد.
Brother Ali, are you available to speak, or are you busy?
Assalamu alaikum salam with the kids right now. I'm listening. Jazakallah for the room. Yeah, I'm watching the kids though. I'm paying attention.
Okay, alhamdulillah. And there was a comment in the back channel. Let me go back a little bit. One of the sisters in the room said that she was interested in finding out about female prisoners. And another comment, really appreciating this feedback. The brother is touching on so many points that people would never think of when thinking of challenges that returning citizens face. Jazakallah khair.
Barakallahu feekum.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Sheikh Ansari, I have a request. There is a brother who's a regular here on Clubhouse. His mother has been ailing for quite some time and has just been sent to the ER. So please, everyone, can you make dua for brother Salim Khan and his mother? So right now she's been sent to the ER and he is asking for dua.
نسأل الله سبحانه وتعالى أن يشفيها شفاء لا يغادر سقما. اللهم رب الناس أذهب البأس واشفي أنت الشافي لا شفاء إلا شفاءك شفاء لا يغادر سقما. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by his beautiful names and his lofty attributes to grant the brother's mother a shifa, a complete and total healing and cure from whatever is ailing her. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant her a cure that is from him, and so it is complete and perfect as he is. And we ask him that shifa is not followed by illness. Ameen ya Rabbal Alameen.
Ameen.
Ameen, ameen, Allahumma ameen.
So, Brother Ansari, I want to ask a question in reference to the topic in which how we can, assist, with aiding and reaching in between the bars. I know that there are, you've listed a lot of things that we can do. As far as volunteering, are there any type of stipulations on, who can volunteer to go inside the prisons when it comes down to sisters or for females going inside the prison system?
Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen wa sallallahu wa sallam wa barak ala nabi Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. So I think every prison system and every jail system is going to have its own criteria. But I think the basic criteria is that the person does not have a criminal record, or the length of time between the time that they've served or been incarcerated and the time when they're volunteering meets whatever threshold or criteria they set. So sometimes, for example, you can have been incarcerated and you have paid your debt to society, and after a year or 2 years or 3 years, whatever criteria they have, you can actually return to the prison. They may have other requirements, like you can't be related to someone who's in a prison where you're going to return. So they'll have specific criteria, but I think basically if a person has no criminal record, or there's enough time that has passed between the time when they were incarcerated and the time where they want to volunteer, I think pretty much most of us would qualify as people who could volunteer. And if for some reason we're not able to actually physically go into prison, that will not prevent us from actually being able to help our brothers and sisters in other ways. As we mentioned, sometimes we can reach in between the bars without actually going into the prisons. But what I would advise any person who is interested in volunteering is that you contact the actual institutional chaplain for the prison where you want to volunteer. And they will kind of walk you through the process and make you aware of whatever criteria is needed to be met in order for you to serve as an approved volunteer in that particular jail or prison.
Okay, alhamdulillah, Jazakallah Khan. And Jazakallah Khan, brother Ali, for posting the link. I see Sister Khulud is back. Sister Khulud, did you have anything you wanted to add or a question or comment?
I think Sister Samantha might have had something. Sister Zah, I can wait until afterwards, inshallah ta'ala.
Okay, so if we go in popcorn style, we'll go with Brother Abu Farid, and then Sister Samantha will come to you, inshallah. Brother Abu Farid, did you have anything?
نعم السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.
وعليكم السلام ورحمة الله وبركاته.
عبدالله كيف حالكم؟
الحمد لله بخير. How you doing, أخي?
Alhamdulillah, Sheikh. Hey man, I remember when I used to be a parole agent here in Michigan, and we had a program for some of the prisoners. It wasn't through the state of Michigan. It wasn't like a state provided program, but it was a program that they had. I believe it was called Breaking the Chains, and I think it's still going on in Ohio. And basically it was for helping prisoners stop recidivism and re-entry and whatnot. And I was just wondering, is there something like that specifically organized by the Muslims? Do you know of any either national programs or any states that have where Muslims have started local programs for prison recidivism and re-entry programs for those Muslim brothers and sisters who are incarcerated? They're reaching parole, or they're on parole and they need assistance. Is there anything like that already established that you know of? And then if not, definitely that's something that I would be interested in as a former parole agent myself.
I'm not aware of anything on a national level. There might be some grassroots things in different localities. But what you're talking about is something which is desperately needed. There are a lot of Christian organizations which are very, very organized, which are doing the work that you're talking about. And they're doing it with a Christian thrust.
Exactly.
And
that's
so,
what the Breaking the Chains is. It's a Christian organization.
Yeah. So basically what we need to do is we need to develop these types of programs which offer an alternative for Muslim inmates, and they do have a national reach. But that's probably going to start with people in localities creating what works for them in their state systems, and then reaching out across state lines to kind of create a standard approach or a standardized approach. But at the very least, what we can do at a local level is start to look at the solutions, or even look at the framework of these organizations like Jumpstart and some of these other Christian organizations. Look at what they're doing and take that framework and then adapt it to Islam and do similar work. One place where that has been done nationally by Muslims is Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous. And so there are people all over the country, and they actually meet on Zoom on a regular basis, where they have something called Millati Islami. And Millati Islami is actually the 12-step program used by AA and Narcotics Anonymous, but it's adapted to Islam. And they basically get together and they talk strategy. Some of them have even have their own clinics in their localities, etc. And so this is what we kind of need to do for what you're talking about, preparing Muslim inmates for life after prison, and doing it in a very organized fashion, creating solutions, creating resources, transitional housing, and all work, basically relationships with employers who will hire felons, vocational training, so when they get out, they can find work and be productive members of society, etc. And some of the issues that often lead to recidivism in the course of creating these types of programs will be eliminating or alleviating or minimizing those causes for recidivism, because unemployment's a big cause of recidivism. Lack of housing is a big problem for a cause for recidivism, etc. And so when you create those solutions, then you're alleviating the problem itself of recidivism. You get less of these guys coming back and more of them who can adapt to society. Also, what we also should be doing or looking at doing is creating relationships with the local masajid so that they can acclimate themselves and become part of the masjid. I think a lot of times there's a stigma associated with prison. We talked about that. And when these guys come out of jail, they're immediately stigmatized, they're ostracized, they're made to feel unwelcome. And many of them do what? Ultimately, because they feel unwelcome, because they feel stigmatized, because they feel that people are looking at them funny, they go back to what? They go back to what they know, which is a lot of people who are not healthy for them religiously and not healthy for them in terms of criminal activity or or recidivism, etc., or the return to criminal activity and recidivism. And so, yeah, we need to do that work. And I'm glad you mentioned that. It's something that should definitely be on our radar and discussions that we should continue to have. And people in localities should meet with like-minded people and start doing that work. It might start as simple as just organizing yourselves and figuring out what jails and prisons will allow you in, and then working out from there. Okay, now that we're in and we see the needs, let's go ahead and start addressing those needs. Transitional housing, vocational programs, substance abuse and behavioral addiction programs, etc., and so on. And from that, create our own jumpstart, basically, our own, like you said, breaking the chains, etc.
Jazakallah khairan. You mentioned the big three as a parole agent. My prisoners usually the main three things that had them returning back to prison. At the top of the list was poverty. I mean, just not being able to get a job, not being able to really support yourself, getting turned down, getting fired all the time, and that which leads to housing issues. So not being able to find a place to live, which, you know, once you start down that road, that path of you don't have money, you don't have a place that you're comfortable. The person that you paroled out to, they're kicking you out of the house. You know, you turn back to the streets, and then you turn back to crime, and you turn and some of them turn back into drugs. I've had parolees who actually committed a crime so they can return, just because they could return, because they felt like, you know, that was the safest place for them. That was the best place where they, you know, the Muslim community just turned their back on them and, you know, treat them like crap. So, you know, they did stuff so they could go back to prison, which is, you know, it's just really, subhanAllah, it's like, you get to that level, it's just really sad, you know, subhanAllah.
Yes, sir. Allah al-Mustaan wa alayhi tuklan.
Alhamdulillah. Sister Samantha, Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Assalamu alaikum, everybody.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
So I wanted to say thank you for this topic. Obviously, this is very near and dear to my heart, as I have started to do prison initiative work in the state of Florida and Vermont. Very different states, but I wanted to just say on a couple of things that just got touched on. I agree there's definitely not anywhere near what we need for rehabilitation programs for our brothers and sisters once they get out. But as Imam Abdullah said, it is huge on what we do in our communities to just be there for them, make them feel like they're part of our community. And reach out to your masjids and see, you know, what is it that we can do as a community. So I was doing some work in Florida, and I found that speaking with the chaplain was different than speaking with individuals. The chaplains believed they needed all these English Qurans and they needed this and they needed that. But when in speaking with the Muslims, they really needed more than that. It was deeper than that. The chaplains were disconnected from them, and these were not Muslim chaplains. So it was interesting to see where it differed. But then in starting to work in my home state of Vermont and speaking with the chaplain at different facilities, I was finding they were very in tune with what the Muslims within those facilities needed. And even when I reached out to individuals to find out what was needed, they were on that same level. So it could very much differ from like very basic, new Muslims all the way to, I've met brothers and sisters that are more advanced, way more advanced than I. And I've learned from and met some very incredible brothers and sisters in Dean through these programs. But what I wanted to share is that I've learned along the way, you really have to define a boundary that you're willing to do with this type of work as well. Are you willing to work as a volunteer, a registered volunteer? Are you willing to work within your own community and mesh involvement? Are you willing to do like one-on-ones and write people? Are you willing to go into the facilities? So there's a lot of different areas that can benefit, but you have to make that boundary for yourself to know what you're willing to do and not do. And I found that important when I found myself having to face that. So if I could give any level of experience and advice there, it would be that. But it's definitely something we need to see more of because we lose them, as Imam Abdullah was saying, we lose them after a short amount of time of them being out. And we don't want that. But thank you, Jazakumullah khair, for this topic tonight. It definitely is what I needed. Thank you.
Alhamdulillah. May Allah accept. May Allah accept.
Ameen. Alhamdulillah. Sister Khulud, Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Imam Abdullah, Jazakallah khair for this topic, for this conversation. I think that it's a very, it's a heavy conversation, I think, personally, in the sense of just thinking about like the communal obligation when it comes to our responsibility, and also understanding where you can best slot in, and to Sister Samantha's point as well, understanding your own emotional balance when it comes to being able to facilitate and to be of service as well. I had a question. I put a few links into the chat, one of them being the one that you mentioned, Millat Islami. Did not know about them, so Jazakallah khair for sharing that as a resource. I've always thought it would be interesting to see a 12-step program that has Islamic principles threaded through it. The question I had was related to just kind of thinking about your advice for someone who is interested in doing this type of work, in the sense of I find myself interested but also hesitant as a Muslim woman, trying to understand where I should best draw that boundary when it comes to being someone who does volunteer. That should I exclusively direct my attention to just volunteering within prisons that with incarcerated Muslim women, and avoiding circumstances that would have me volunteering in any capacity within incarcerated in a male prison, essentially, as well. Trying to understanding how I should best go about it. We do have Link outside in California here for the Imam Abdullah. I'm not sure if you're familiar with them.
Mm-hmm.
And I've reached out to a few chaplains. They're not very responsive. I don't mean not to be offensive. They're not very responsive, and the turnaround time is a lot harder. So I think, based off of what you mentioned, it might be better to just be registered with the prison itself. I personally feel that I'm comfortable with the idea of going in as a thing, as a way of volunteering. But I also wanted to make sure that I wasn't what your advice would be for, as a sister kind of thinking about volunteering in this type of capacity, essentially.
Alhamdulillah, sallallahu wasallam wa barak ala Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. So very good questions. I'm going to start out with chaplains not being responsive. What I've found in my experience is that you have some really, really good chaplains who understand what their job is, and you have a lot who don't. And the ones that don't are going to give you what you've seen. That lack of responsiveness, you have to chase them, you have to pin them down, and you may actually have to circumvent them, unfortunately, to make them do their job. But their job is actually to facilitate the religious observances of the inmates in the institutions that they serve, regardless of those religious observances. And that includes like pagans, people who practice pagan religions, people who practice witchcraft as a religion. And so it certainly would include a divinely revealed religion like Islam. But unfortunately, the reality is that inherent bias, implicit bias is a real thing. And chaplains are not immune to it. And so therefore, you're going to have that, you're going to face it. And if we're really serious about doing this work, we just have to keep pressing forward and trying to get things done to the best of our ability. And if the chaplain becomes an obstacle to that, we may have to circumvent him. But at the end of the day, our brothers and sisters, they need us, as we've clearly outlined in the talk today. And so since they need us, we need to do what we can to be there for them. And that may, as I said, mean, just constantly calling and writing and pressuring until we get what we want, or actually circumventing the obstacle that the chaplain has presented himself to be. That being said, you talked a little bit about wanting to volunteer and wanting some advice on volunteering. And so what I would suggest is, first of all, be realistic with yourself, be honest with yourself, sit with yourself and say, what am I actually capable of doing? What am I actually capable of doing in terms of the time I have, the free time I have, the amount of just energy that I can dedicate to the work that I want to do in helping the incarcerated. So just be honest with yourself about that. That's the first thing. The second thing is I would not recommend going into a male prison. I would not recommend that. I would recommend working exclusively with females as a female, and I believe that males should work exclusively with males. I just don't believe it's a good idea, irrespective of the level, the security level you're going to go into. That would be my recommendation based upon my experience. I think that the females will really, really appreciate your presence. That's what I know from the females that I serve. I actually had a conversation with some ladies who I teach on Tuesdays today. And you can just see the conversation. They asked about a female who used to volunteer, who has not volunteered and not been in the prison since the COVID pandemic. And although we, where I am, are coming out of and no longer under the restrictions that were imposed due to COVID, and for the most part, we're opening back up and volunteers are coming back in, etc. That particular female volunteer has not returned. And they were just asking, just like how she was doing. They didn't necessarily ask if she was coming back in, but the discussion ultimately went there about having some female volunteers and how much they would appreciate that. Just having someone who could relate to them on a different level than a so-called Muslim chaplain. There's only so much that you can give them as a male dealing with females. There are certain conversations that they may want to have, and just a certain ability to relate that a female volunteer could provide. And so I think that the females would really, really appreciate, the ladies would appreciate that. And so I would encourage you, if you're able to volunteer at a jail or a prison where there are female inmates, to do that. And then after that, ask yourself, well, what do I feel comfortable with? What do I feel comfortable providing? What service or services do I feel comfortable providing? And be honest with yourself about that, and do that, and stay within that realm and that sphere. And don't feel bad or guilty if they're asking you to do more. Be realistic about what you can do, about what you feel comfortable doing, and do that. And it's better to do whatever you feel comfortable doing well, exceptionally well, than to overextend yourself trying to do what they want you to do that you're not really comfortable doing, or you're not really capable of doing, and do it poorly. And then that creates a certain level of resentment and bitterness on their part, and a feeling of being let down. The other thing is, it's important for all of us, if we're considering doing this work, is to take a step back and ask ourselves, why do you want to do this work? Why do you want to do it? It's very important that we have the right intentions. We know that our religion is a God-centered religion, and it is a religion where the foundation of it is intention, purity of intention, to the point the Prophet said in the hadith, إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ وَإِنَّمَا لِكُلِّ امْرِئٍ مَا نَوَى. He said, actions are but by intentions. And every person will receive a reward or a recompense for the deeds he does based upon his motives. And so we have to make sure we have the right motives. Why am I going in there? And what are my intentions? And make sure that we keep those intentions pure and throughout whatever we're doing. So if we're in there for 3 months, if we're in there for 6 months, if we're in there for a year, always go back to the why. Why am I here? What am I trying to do? I'm trying to help. I'm trying to serve. I'm trying to uplift. I'm trying to encourage. I'm trying to let these brothers and sisters know they are not the sum of the crimes that they committed. I'm trying to let them know that Islam is their salvation. Islam is a way for them to reform and rehabilitate themselves and to make themselves whole, etc. This is why I'm here. This is why I do what I do. And if we can keep that in front of our eyes all the time and at the forefront of our minds, we can do great things. And so this is the advice that I would give anyone who wants to do this work.
Jazakallah khair, Imam Abdullah. I had a final question. I know to me it sounds a little silly, I will acknowledge, but it's still something I'm curious about. How do you regulate the emotional side of it, Imam Abdullah? I worry about what it will be to manage this emotionally.
I don't know if you do regulate it. I think emotion is not something that we need to be afraid of. I think the emotion is one of the things going to be the wind in our sails and help us to continue to show up every day or every week or every month, however often we volunteer and come into the prison. I'll be quite frank, and I'll be very, very candid, very open, very vulnerable. I have gone into prison and interacted with brothers and sisters who are incarcerated, and seen what they're going through and their struggles, and seeing people who are just extremely sincere and committed and really, really trying and struggling and striving to be better. And try to really, really give myself to this cause to help them in their endeavors. I've cried, I've wept, I've gotten angry, I've gotten disappointed, I've gotten depressed. And to be honest with you, all of those emotions have helped me do my job and helped me succeed and get better and overcome obstacles, etc. So I don't think we should run from the emotion. I think emotion is a big part of it. It should be a part of it. If our hearts aren't into it, if our hearts aren't in it, we're not gonna succeed. We're not gonna succeed and do what we set out to do. Our hearts have to be into it. And so I don't think we should be afraid of the emotion. I think we should embrace it. But as the Prophet ﷺ alluded to in a number of hadith, the emotion shouldn't control us. We should, rein in the emotions. So we ride the wave of the emotions. We use the emotions as a spur, But the emotions should never be something that controls us. We're we're in control. I hope that doesn't sound like a contradiction.
No,
Because
not at all.
I don't mean it to be. But basically, we ride the wave of the emotions. We benefit from the emotions. We use the emotions as fuel, but we don't become overcome by the emotions. Maybe that's a better way to say it than control.
Allah يحييك Imam Abdullah.
Allah yubarak fiki. Allah yubarak fiki.
Okay, Assalamu alaikum, Osama. Are you still with us? Do you have a question or comment?
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Yeah, I just wanted to share a resource. I don't know whether Brother Abdullah actually shared it or not. I actually attended a workshop just 2 weeks ago by a foundation that helps Muslim prisoners in prisons.
Mm-hmm.
It's called the Taiba Foundation, actually. And it is one of the few American organizations that are serving Muslims in prison nationwide. So they offer an Islamic curriculum, and that helps like the converts to cover their essentials of their faith. And so some of the dedicated students that reach up to a level, they become teachers in local communities, actually. And so, that workshop that I attended, it was actually in my state's masajids that they actually did the workshops. We invited them as speakers, and they actually they did an educational seminar on the prophetic model of teaching. So they actually told us, and there are like different levels that they teach at the prison. Like it goes from introduction to Islam to fiqh. They have like fiqh 101, intro level fiqh 101. They have adab 101. They have fiqh 102. They have, it was like such a lot to take in when they were explaining that these are the levels. So if one passes the intro level, they get to the 100 level stage 1. And then they also teach them Quran 101, Hadith 101, Usul 101. So all of that stuff, it's actually at the level or the stage 2. And then they actually help them as they have re-entry managers and clinicians who work with them. So it offers these programs to the incarcerated Muslims and, people who are suffering from trauma, addiction, and mental health disorders. So, and actually they have a very good, they have a lot of good testimonials as well. And you get to meet actual people who are now a part of the foundation. And they just opened a local chapter in my state, so I'm volunteering for that.
Mm-hmm.
So and it's actually caters to Muslims, and like the way that they have the statistics and how like they're telling like how many Muslims are converting in prisons, it's like from every 10 persons, like 9 of them actually choose Islam as their faith.
Mm-hmm.
And there's also a huge story about there was a prisoner in the state of Florida actually who had I don't know whether people know about this story or not, but I remember the story because I came across it, that he had a tattoo of kafir actually on his neck, and he's now he reverted inside the prison. He was a white redneck, and now he's the prison imam actually, and he's the prison imam, and and how he became the imam was an interesting story. That one of the re-entry managers, his name is actually this program is created by Sheikh Rami. I don't know whether people know him. I have this book in front of me. Let me check his name. Yeah, Sheikh Rami Soor is actually the founding director. I don't know whether people know him.
Yeah, he was mentioned in that Vox article that I was telling you about. And Al-Tayyiba was also mentioned. But go ahead,
Yes.
Osama. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, the Taiba Foundation is the main go-to source for Muslims, incarcerated Muslims all across the nation, and they are actually trying to expand their organization and their offices to help, because they mostly cater to California right now, and they're doing it in other southwestern states and starting to expand, and they're actually teaching people the method like they're using, and they're actually it's a pretty streamlined method that they have of teaching all these. So the prisoners get the education within the prison, and then they actually become teachers in their community, and they're actually helped with the re-entry and all of these vocational programs that we were all mentioning, like how do they get the jobs when they get out of the prison. So yeah, I'm doing my part as much as I can to help, because I feel like there's so many people inside the prison that we actually sometimes we concentrate on people outside the prisons too, but like and they actually like teach you according to a lot of like their workshop is kind of like based on like how like they're teaching it, the method of the teaching, and they actually take it from the Prophet Sallallahu, like how he used to teach, and it's an overview of the prophetic model of education and how to avoid useless knowledge, and how like every like sometimes you also use humor during teaching, how to actually deal with admonishment and reminders, and also taking into consideration the difference in the students too. So it was like a mind-blowing workshop that I attended, and so I just wanted to tell about this resource because this is the only. I mean, somebody asked for a nationwide resource, and just to touch upon like how Sister Khulud asked like how like about like because I did it through my local masjid too. I tried to get the data of the Muslims in the state penitentiary, and call the sheriff's office and all, to get the data of like how many Muslims are there. So I think back in 2020 it was 1,200 Muslims, at least from in my state, and there was a lot of demand of Spanish Qurans. Like they were saying, hey, we have droves and droves of Muslims that are demanding Spanish Qurans, and we need those. So a lot of Hispanics inside the prison who were converting, and so and also about the emotional part, like I'm just going to share because my friend actually, since we graduated from the same college, he actually, so this was not a part of the foundation, but he, from the school, they used to volunteer to the high prisons, basically the prisons where they keep the big murderers, and the max one. Yeah, the max one. I was trying to find that word, the max state prisons. And so over there, he used to tell like how they were chained with the they were actually cuffed with their legs with the chairs and the tables, and how there was a screen. But again, like emotion is there, but you have to like he got pretty sad when he saw their state, because he used to teach them physics and biology. And so he was telling me like how, but again it takes a big heart too. So like the state of the condition, it actually will create a lot of emotions within you, and yeah, you'll have to have a tawakkul of Allah and go into with a positive mindset. And so I just wanted to share this resource about the Taiba Foundation because they are a big name, and they have their own books. So if you go on Amazon, they even like I'll just take the name of the book because it's in front of me. It's called the Islamic 12-Step Addiction Recovery Program. So they have their own Islamic recovery program book, and they have a huge number of books, and they teach their books too. And most of their books are even like people were saying like they can even teach kids in high school too about all of these certain fiqh and Islamic education books actually that they've published. And yeah, just wanted to share that.
Hey, Jazakallah khair, Osama. Thank you very much. You could work for them as a spokesperson.
I'm still doing volunteer work because I do have their business cards as well. Like they give me their business cards, all their emails and work information and everything. So I'm still on a volunteer. Like
no, brother, they need to hire you, man. They need to hire you, brother, full time, brother. I'm an engineer. You're giving your work for free, brother. You're a huge. Inshallah. MashaAllah, alhamdulillah.
I'm not getting kickback at the very minimum.
Allah al-Musta'an wa alayhi tuklan. Tayyib Zahida, are we ready to wrap up, or do you have something else?
No, I just.
Do you mind if I add something very quickly, just to shed some light based on something that Sister Khulud said? I live in Texas. I live 30 minutes away from the largest female ICE detention center. So although this talk has been focused on the incarcerated, there are plenty of women who have crossed the border who have not been formally charged or prosecuted but are detained.
Subhanallah.
And of the 500 women, at least 10% of them are already Muslim. Now, what's unique about the detention centers, the immigration detention centers all across the country, is that they probably don't speak English. So if anybody would like to do, prison support or any type of da'wah, just know that there are Muslim brothers and sisters already in this country that are behind bars that don't speak English.
Subhanallah.
And probably they are giving da'wah that they can to their fellow detainees. So this largest female detention center is operated by Core Civic. For those of you who know, Core Civic is, bad news bears in my mind. But yes, just please make dua for the individuals who are trying to look for freedom in this country, but that are met with detention and don't speak English.
Jazakallah khairan, Umar, for that. Jazakallah khairan. Thank you for sharing that. Jazakallah khairan.
Alhamdulillah, Jazakallah Karen, everybody, especially for those who posted the links in the back channel. Very beneficial information. I know Brother Ali is with the kids and didn't have a chance to speak tonight, but alhamdulillah, the replays are on for those who joined the room late. And inshallah, I'm not sure what the next topic is going to be on the Reverts Roundtable. Brother Abdullah, if you want to go ahead and give us that information before we close out, and then we're going to say salam alaikum, good night. Inshallah.
Yeah, it's late, and I don't want to show my hand. And also, what I generally do is I don't know what I'm going to talk about next. I let it kind of come organically. So sometimes somebody will give me an awesome suggestion, and I'll give credit. This was Zahida's suggestion. May Allah reward her. Or sometimes something will happen, either in my own experience interacting with other reverts, or something will happen, just a current event, and it will inspire me to talk about something that I think that we as reverts should talk about. So what I would say to the group is, if you have one of those awesome suggestions for a topic, then please send it our way. You can get at Zahida. You can drop something in the back channel if you want. And you can also reach out to me. I think most of you guys have my contact information. And just let me know what you're thinking you'd like to hear on the round table. And we'll definitely take up that topic, inshallah ta'ala, if we feel that it's really going to be beneficial for our group and for our gathering. I want to thank everyone who participated. Again, as Zahida said, some excellent resources were shared so that we can all benefit from those resources. And there were some very awesome contributions made to the discussion by all of you. May Allah reward all of you. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless what remains of your nights. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless your tomorrow and bless your every day after tomorrow. May He bless your houses, bless your spouses, bless your families and your children, bless your sources of livelihood and income. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless you all and make you blessed wherever you may be. May He shower you with His blessings and surround you with His protection. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by His names and attributes to give you all good and to protect you from all evil. Hadha wa sallallahu wa sallam wa barakat bi Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.